All right, so let's jump right into a huge question. How do you even begin to understand a complex, ancient text like the Quran? Today, we're going to unpack one specific method from a source that argues the key isn't just in the words themselves, but in the world they were spoken to. And really, this is the heart of the problem, isn't it? We're talking about a massive gap in time, in culture, and in language. So how do you bridge that? It's not just about translating words, it's about trying to understand a world that, in many ways, just doesn't exist anymore. So, the source we're looking at uses this brilliant analogy to frame the problem. Imagine someone hands you a perfect, detailed owner's manual for a classic Mercedes-Benz. It's pristine, but you don't have the car. You can read all you want about spark plugs and transmissions, but without the engine right there in front of you, without that original context, it's all just theory. That car, that's the world the text was born into. Okay, so let's unpack the interpretive method that comes out of that analogy. The argument is actually pretty simple, but it's really powerful. The Quran, like any text, just cannot be understood in a vacuum. It was revealed into a world, and it was speaking to that world. So here's the core idea from the source material. Meaning is just inseparable from its original context. And that includes everything: the specific Arabic dialect being spoken, the cultural norms, the traditions that were already in place, and the social problems that people in 7th century Arabia were dealing with every day. And this is a perfect example of that. The source points out that the Quran doesn't explain everything from scratch. It just assumes its first audience already knows the names of the months, or which ones are sacred, or the basic postures for prayer. The car, that whole framework of culture and tradition, was already there. The manual was providing guidance on how to tune it up and use it properly. All right, let's put this context is key method to the test. We're going to apply it to our first case study, a really well-known passage about polygyny and wealth, and see how this lens can potentially shift the entire meaning. Okay, so here's where things get really interesting. A common modern reading often starts with the assumption that monogamy is the default, but our source argues that's basically reading the past through a modern lens. In 7th century Arabia, polygyny was already the societal norm. So if the verse wasn't introducing the practice, what was it doing? Well, according to the source, it wasn't about marriage at all. It was about money. See, the source argues that to get what the verse is doing, you have to know the specific social problem it was trying to solve. And in this case, that problem was financial exploitation. A male guardian could marry his wealthy orphaned ward, and by doing so, gain unlawful control of her inheritance. A practice that, by the way, the verses right before this one explicitly warned against. Okay, so the source lays out this kind of logical test to poke holes in that common reading. Let's walk through it together. Step 1, the verse opens by talking about orphan girls. So the test is, what happens if we apply that specific term, orphan girls, to the entire instruction that follows? Well, it would mean you can marry 2, 3, or 4 orphan girls. But it would also mean that if you fear you won't be just, you have to marry only 1 orphan girl. The source argues this leads to a conclusion that just doesn't make sense. It would mean that all men are obligated to only marry orphans. So the takeaway here, the crucial point according to this source, is this. The verse isn't laying down a new law on marriage. It's a regulation on wealth. The message in this reading becomes something like, why would you unjustly marry your orphan ward just to get her wealth when you can justly marry any other woman? It's a redirection, a powerful warning against financial exploitation. Okay, so that's case study 1. Now, let's take that exact same lens, looking for the social problem, and apply it to something completely different. The ideas of hypocrisy and repentance in Surah Al-Tawbah. So this chapter sets up a really stark contrast. On one side, you have the foremost believers, and they're promised paradise. But on the other side, you have those who have mastered hypocrisy, and they're promised this kind of mysterious double punishment, not in the afterlife, but right here, in this world. So that's the big question, right? What on earth is this punishment that happens twice in this world? The text doesn't spell out a legal penalty. So what are the real-world social consequences of hypocrisy for an entire community? Well, the source gives us a sociological answer. The first punishment is individual, a total loss of social currency. The hypocrite becomes the boy who cried wolf. Their words just don't mean anything anymore. The second punishment is communal. The whole society starts to decay from within. It might look shiny and strong on the outside, but inside, it's rusting out, ready to collapse. Okay, so think about that for a second. If hypocrisy is a social disease that rots a community from the inside out, then the source argues the cure has to be social too. It can't just be a private, internal feeling. It has to be an action. And this is where it gets really interesting. According to this reading, the verses that follow actually lay out a whole public, communal process for repentance. It's not just about feeling sorry in private. It involves a public confession, giving charity as a physical act of purification, and making a real vow to reform, all while being supported and observed by the entire community. And this quote from the text just drives that point home. It shows that accountability isn't just vertical, between a person and God. It's also horizontal. The entire community of believers is part of this process of observation and hopefully reformation. So you see the pattern here, right? The conclusion flows directly from how the problem was framed in the first place. Once you understand hypocrisy as a communal disease, the text's description of repentance as this public, five-step process makes perfect, practical sense. The remedy is designed to match the scale of the problem. All right, let's wrap this up by going back to where we started, the importance of the interpretive method itself. It's not just about the conclusions we reach, but about how we get there. At the end of the day, the argument we've been exploring is pretty simple, but it's powerful. A text's true meaning is unlocked when we stop trying to use our modern world as the key and instead use the world the text was actually speaking to. You have to understand the car to have any chance of properly reading the manual. And think about it. We looked at two totally different issues through this one lens. The verses on polygamy were reframed from being about marriage to being about financial ethics. And the verses on hypocrisy were reframed from being about a private sin to a public problem that needed a communal cure. In both cases, the key was understanding the specific, real-world issue the text was addressing in its own time. And that really leaves us with a huge final question to think about. This was an explainer about one method of reading. But whether we see a text as a rule book for marriage or a warning on financial ethics, as a private sin or a social problem, those interpretations don't just stay on the page. They shape the communities and the worlds we build today. So the real question isn't just what we read, but how we read, and what kind of world that reading helps us create.